Okay, so far you have seen how to use the code first workflow both with a blank database and an existing one. Now, when you create a model, it's very unlikely that that model is going to stay the same for the lifetime of your application. There are always times that you need to change your model. And as you have discovered so far, with the code first workflow, first we change the model, and then we use migrations to bring the database up to date. So in this lecture, we're going to take a closer look at these migrations. I'm going to show you various kind of changes that you can make in your model and the implications on your database. So back in Visual Studio, here's the project that we created in the last lecture. We created our model based on an existing database. Now take a look at the Solution Explorer. We don't have a folder called Migrations, so migrations are not enabled for this project. So the first step is to go to Package Manager console and run enable migrations. Beautiful, now we got the migrations folder. Now we need to create our first migration. A migration that represents our initial model. So if you run this migration on a blank database, it's going to bring that database up to sync with this model. So add migration. I'm going to call it initial model. Just an arbitrary name. So let's take a look at this migration. Okay, so take a look. It tries to create a table for authors, courses, tags, and tag courses. But we already have these tables in our database because we started with an existing database. So if I run this migration now, I'm going to get an exception. How do we resolve this? When you start with an existing database and you want to create your first migration, you need to use a switch that is called Ignore Changes. With this switch, you tell Entity Framework that whatever you have in your model now already exists in your database. Let's see how it works. So back in Package Manager console, I'm going to run add migration again, call it initial model, use the switch Ignore Changes, and I want to force this migration to be recreated. So I use the force switch. Okay, now the migration is changed. So let's take a look. Look, it's an empty migration. Now, one thing you need to know about code first migrations is that you can only have one pending migration at a time. So before me making any changes to my model, I need to run this empty migration on the database. So Entity Framework will be able to keep track of the changes. So back to Package Manager console. Update database. So let's take a quick look at our database. Okay, here's our database. Look, we got underlying migration history, which was created by Entity Framework to keep track of changes in the database. And here are the existing tables in our database. Now let's start making a few changes in our model. But before we get started, I want to give you a golden rule of thumb. Always work on small changes and small migrations. So instead of making 10 changes in your model at once, make a small change, create a migration, bring the database up to date, and then repeat. Now you might ask, why am I suggesting this? Because when you work with a big migration, there is always a chance for errors. With a small migration, you reduce the chance for errors significantly. Plus, think of migrations like your source code repository. It's much more efficient to write a little bit of code and commit it to a repository for better versioning, as opposed to writing 10,000 lines of code and making a huge commit to the repository. Okay, so let's make a few changes in our model and learn more about migrations.